Roger, thank you so much for your kind introduction and indeed for inviting me here today to have this opportunity to speak. And it's great to see quite so many people. I can see quite a few familiar faces among you. And I'm sure that the draw is not actually Bridget Kendall, but this man up here. Although I kind of wonder if he's really only box office for people of a certain age. I remember the friend of a niece of ours discovering that I was a BBC correspondent. She said, "Oh, have you ever interviewed anyone really famous?" And I was thinking, well, you know, who would impress her? Because obviously British politicians wouldn't. So I said, well, Vladimir Putin. And she said, who's he? So not everybody knows. But anyway, my subject in this lecture is the crisis between Russia and the West over Ukraine. And when I decided to focus on this last year, it was a bit unclear how it would unfold. Would it escalate, or would it start to wind down? Or would the main drama by now be in Kiev, a government collapsing under pressure of war and bankruptcy and infighting? In the event, it wasn't any of those, but another well-known post-Soviet scenario, a more or less frozen conflict with a nominal ceasefire only partly observed, the underlying causes of the dispute unresolved, raising the prospect of rebel areas of eastern Ukraine being left in limbo for years to come. But what has become clearer is that this isn't just about Ukraine. This is also about Russia. And so that's why it's the Russian perspective I want to focus on today. Why did President Putin respond in the way he did in Ukraine by annexing Crimea? And why did so many Russians support him? And what explains the surge of patriotism in Russia? And some thoughts on how all this may play out. So first of all, how did we get here? Well, let's remember at the start of 2014, no one was expecting a dangerous explosion in relations between Russia and the West. President Putin was about to open the most expensive Winter Olympic Games ever in the Black Sea town of Sochi, an event designed to showcase Russia as a modern, attractive country able to stage a glittering party as impressive as anything in London or Beijing. And doubtless aiming to assuage Western concerns about Russia's human rights record, President Putin had just released what were probably the country's most famous prisoners: the Pussy Riot, women activists jailed for singing a sacrilegious punk song in a cathedral, and Mikhail Hodorkovsky, the former oil tycoon and opposition champion who'd spent over 10 years behind bars, but suddenly found himself whisked from a Russian prison camp to the tarmac of the airport in Berlin and a new life in emigration. And in a phone call to exchange Christmas wishes with David Cameron and to try and persuade him to attend the Sochi Olympics, President Putin told the British Prime Minister he was trying to be as liberal as he possibly could. At least that's what Mr. Cameron told me when we found ourselves on the BBC Andrew Marr's show one Sunday morning a few weeks later. The UK was handing over the Olympic baton from the 2012 Games in London, which had been so much of Roger's part for so many years, and passed on to Russia the rotating presidency of the G8 club. And 2014 was supposed to be a bridge-building year between Russia and the UK, a year of cultural exchanges. Internationally, Russia was also playing a positive role in some arenas. At the Iran nuclear talks, Western diplomats described Russia's role as largely helpful. And on Syria, the US and Russian presidents had patched up their tetchy disagreement and begun to collaborate on disposing of Syria's chemical weapons. In fact, in January 2014, their foreign ministers even jointly launched Syrian peace talks in Geneva, which got nowhere, but it was still a diplomatic milestone. At the same time, there were, of course, warning signs. Relations between Russia and the West had actually, for years, been fraying. So let's just list a few of the ways. There was that rupture in relations with Britain over the murder in London in 2006 of the former KGB officer Alexander Litvinenko with a trail of radioactive polonium leading back to Moscow. There was the cyber attack, which temporarily shut down Estonia's internet services in 2007, the suspected work of Russian hackers. There was Russia's brief war with Georgia in 2008, in many ways a precursor to the Ukraine crisis, as we shall hear. And there was the growing drumbeat of accusations from Mr. Putin that the West was meddling in Russia's affairs, starting with the so-called Orange Revolution in Kiev in 2004 and 5, and ending with anti-Kremlin street protests in Russia itself in 2011, all, according to Mr. Putin, stirred up by the Americans. And after the US Congress enacted the so-called Magnitsky Act in 2012, which was to blacklist Russian officials who'd allegedly been involved in the death in custody of a lawyer called Sergei Magnitsky, Kremlin's suspicions of ill intent by the West towards Russia reached fever pitch. The Russian government banned the adoption of Russian orphans by Americans. Russian top state officials were told to liquidate their foreign assets and sell their property so they'd be less vulnerable to blackmail from abroad, said the Kremlin. And Russian NGOs were told to desist from receiving foreign funding or else they'd be classified as foreign agents or spies. And new laws banned the promotion of gay rights, allegedly to protect Russian minors against homosexual propaganda, but also to highlight Russia's new vision of itself as a beacon of conservative values in contrast to the degenerate morals of North America and Western Europe. And so a long list to suggest that Russia was a problem for the West, but nonetheless still a country with whom it was possible to do business and collaborate with on a case-to-case basis. So how did we go from that to the most dangerous rift between Russia and the West since the end of the Cold War? Well, as we know, the trigger was Ukraine, which has always looked both West and East. In the second half of 2013, Moscow became agitated about what it saw as a threat to its close relationship with Ukraine. What it was worried about was an EU trade agreement which President Putin feared would scupper his plan to have Ukraine join his own customs union, the Eurasian Union. In the EU, officials thought the offer was rather innocuous and highly technical, a trade deal. It wasn't about Ukraine joining NATO or a pathway to membership of the EU. It was just a set of incentives to try and get Ukraine to embark on much-needed reforms. But to Mr. Putin, it looked like a deliberate maneuver by the West to lure Ukraine out of Russia's sphere of influence with, in his eyes, profound implications for trade and security. The problem was that what Mr. Putin wanted, and what many people in Ukraine desired, was the complete opposite. So in November 2013, Ukraine's president, Viktor Yanukovych, was summoned by President Putin to Sochi for a talking to. The Russian leader had already successfully arm-twisted the president of Armenia into backing out of a similar EU trade partnership. And now he thought he could do the same with Ukraine, especially as he was offering a significant amount of cash to help Ukraine pay its debts. No surprise then that on return to Kiev, President Yanukovych announced he'd changed his mind and he was pulling out of the EU trade deal. But some Ukrainians were deeply dismayed by this, what they saw as their president's capitulation to Moscow. They took to the streets in Kiev in protest. Before long, the number of demonstrators swelled. This was the so-called Maidan popular uprising, and by January and February of 2014, it was reaching crisis point. So in mid-February, in some parts of Western Ukraine, closest to Poland, where pro-Western feeling was strongest, street protesters took the law into their own hands. They overpowered local police, they surrounded arms depots, they set fires to some official buildings, and in some places they declared self-rule from Yanukovych's central government in Kiev. And in the capital, Kiev, there was violence too, including one momentous day when anonymous rooftop snipers fired on both police and protesters, killing dozens of people. It's still not clear who was behind the order to open fire and what they hoped to achieve. But recognizing that his ability to keep order was slipping away, President Yanukovych agreed to an EU-brokered compromise with opposition leaders, which allowed him to remain as president, but with his powers eroded. The next day, seemingly in panic, he fled the capital, out of fear for his life, he later said. When it became clear President Yanukovych had disappeared, the Maidan opposition leaders moved swiftly to fill the vacuum. A new interim government was sworn in by the Ukrainian parliament, including by some of Mr. Yanukovych's former supporters, and was quickly, some would say too hastily, endorsed by the United States and European governments. But to the Kremlin, this was an illegal coup. The Russian Foreign Ministry expressed outrage at the TV pictures depicting insurrection in Western Ukraine and bloodshed in Kiev. Moscow claimed that Ukrainian nationalists in league with neo-Nazis and fascists had seized power and were now threatening the rights of the country's Russian speakers. It was, Moscow claimed, all part of a plot inspired and funded by Washington to turn Ukraine away from Russia. Meanwhile, President Putin watched the drama unfold from Sochi, where the Winter Olympics was underway. Instead of a jubilant spectacle showing off Russia at its best, the upheaval in Kiev was dominating the airwaves. And I remember thinking at the time, President Putin's always been thin-skinned. He can't bear to lose. He can't tolerate being humiliated. Just how angry must he be to have his all-important Olympic party sidelined? And how much more angry must he be that his plans for Ukraine had been rebuffed in such a public manner? What on earth will Putin do to get his own back, I thought. Well, we soon found out. The moment the Sochi Games were over, he ordered his Security Council to retaliate by implementing a plan, possibly already drafted and taken off some dusty shelf, to take over control of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula, which was where Russia's Black Sea Fleet was based and which had a large Russian-speaking population, along with Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. In a mirror image of the TV pictures from Western Ukraine and Kiev, pro-Russian crowds thronged onto the streets in the Crimean capital to call for a change of power. And in a mirror image of what had happened in Kiev, those officials loyal to Kiev were sent packing, and they were replaced by new officials who answered to Moscow. Within weeks, there was a hastily arranged referendum, which provided the pretext for Mr. Putin to declare that Crimea was being annexed and returned to the motherland, a move which proved enormously popular among many Russian speakers in Crimea and across Russia itself. Those in Crimea who were not in favour stayed at home and shut the door, either as a protest or out of fear, and their absence from the referendum was conveniently forgotten. As his presidential ratings soared, Mr. Putin flexed his rhetorical muscles. He began to question the historical validity of Ukraine's eastern regions, saying they were rightly Russian lands. In his speech to mark the triumphant return of Crimea to Russia, he even threatened to intervene to protect the rights of all Russian speakers anywhere, even beyond Russia's borders. By April, smallish groups of Russian-speaking locals began to try to take over buildings in eastern Ukraine. Before long, with help from what looked like Russian troops from across the border, their piecemeal protests had turned into armed insurrection. Their demands fluctuated from more autonomy from Kiev to complete secession and reincorporation into Russia. In Moscow, Mr. Putin denied that serving Russian soldiers were involved. He claimed if there were any troops there, they were on holiday. And any tanks and other hardware had all been seized from Ukrainian depots. And all of that resulted with where we are now. A simmering civil conflict on the eastern edge of Ukraine, closest to Russia, with thousands dead, over 1 million refugees, and some areas turned into uninhabitable war zones. There have now been 3 rounds of sanctions imposed by the United States and Europe, who saw in President Putin's moves a flagrant breach of international law and a danger, if not checked, to the future stability of Europe. Currently, a ceasefire is theoretically in place, but fighting and casualties are being reported every day, and the chances of it producing a lasting settlement look remote. In Europe, President Putin's Russia is now regularly called one of the most serious threats to European security. It sometimes seems as though NATO commanders have found a new purpose in being able to flag up their old enemy, especially after a less than triumphant campaign in Afghanistan. But there's also a real worry that Russia presents a genuine menace, and those flying bombers to test NATO's air defences as far south as Cornwall and Portugal are really something to worry about. In particular, the Baltic states, all with Russian-speaking minorities and all of them territories occupied by Stalin's Russia 75 years ago, fear they could be the next target. A young woman from Estonia came up to me last week at a seminar and asked me anxiously if I thought that Russia really would invade her country. In Lithuania, they're reintroducing conscription. Meanwhile, on their side, ordinary Russians are also adjusting to a sense of emergency. Inflation is running at 17%. The ruble has plummeted in value, even though it's recovered a bit recently, but few experts seem to think the rally will last. Jobs are being cut as private businesses struggle and as the government imposes cuts of, in some sectors, 10% across the board to compensate for falling oil revenues and loss of investment. Russian state television tells viewers that sanctions amount to an act of economic warfare, and a Western campaign to weaken and fragment their country is already underway. President Putin has publicly warned he may have to put nuclear forces on alert against Western aggression. At a recent dinner party in Moscow, I was astonished to find that all the Russians around the table thought that a real war between Russia and the West might be inevitable, either because they believed their president and took at face value what they heard on Russian television, or because they did not, but they suspected the worst of him and feared that escalating the crisis might suit his purpose. So what's the background to all this? Could it have been avoided, and who should take the blame? Well, those are the big questions. And one way of approaching a better understanding of what's going on, I think, is to go back to Russia's recent history, starting with the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991. Because in some ways, the crisis we're in the midst of now is unfinished business from that time. And Russia's behavior, Mr. Putin's behavior, can partly be explained as a culmination of over 20 years of grievances. There's a lot been said about the sense of Russian loss and humiliation following the Soviet collapse, and rightly so. It shouldn't be underestimated. To Western observers, the end of Soviet communism seemed like a good news story for everyone, an extraordinary end to over 70 years of political oppression and a revolution which happened almost without bloodshed. I remember a series of radio documentaries I made at the time, which we called A Revolution Without Shots. And I've often thought since what a credit it was to the Russian people and their leaders that they managed this painful transition so relatively peacefully in comparison to the bloodshed and near anarchy that we see, for example, in Syria. But perhaps my assumption was too glib, because what we're seeing today in eastern Ukraine is also a consequence of the Soviet empire unraveling. It's just that it took 20 years for it to erupt into bloodshed and violence. When the Soviet Union ended, it's true that many in Russia were jubilant, especially if they were educated and entrepreneurial or had foreign languages. It was at last a chance to travel and start new businesses and develop their individual potential. But for those who are part of the old system, party or government officials, or like Vladimir Putin, members of the KGB security services, it was a tragedy. They were now being blamed for all the ills of the old system, and they had to scrabble to reinvent themselves. Mr. Putin relaunched himself as deputy mayor of St. Petersburg and from there leapfrogged into a political career in the Kremlin. Other former KGB personnel weren't so lucky. I remember one man who came to visit me in the BBC Moscow bureau wearing a carefully pressed but very old suit and carrying a battered leather briefcase. He was a former intelligence officer and he wanted to collaborate with the BBC on investigations for a monthly fee. He never adequately explained what he was proposing. It was just a desperate attempt to find employment. His briefcase, when he opened it, had almost nothing in it, just a few papers, an apple, and an errant cockroach, which scuttled under my desk. And for many ordinary citizens of Russia, trapped in remote parts of the country where opportunities were non-existent, and who had little experience of the outside world and little understandings of the risks as well as the benefits of a market economy, the transition wasn't just scary, it was terrifying. The old world may have been food shortages and miserable living standards, and restrictions from the party on what you could say and do, but at least everyone had a job, and prices always stayed the same. Now suddenly there was the prospect of unemployment with no proper state safety nets and rampant hyperinflation. I remember talking to the director of a knitting factory, government-owned, in one town, who didn't want it privatised. "I can't deal with the stress of having to make a profit," she said. And indeed, the number of people dying from heart attacks and other stress-related illnesses rocketed. On the streets, you would see old ladies in panic because every time they went into a shop or kiosk, the prices had gone up. And I can remember interviewing men on the factory floor telling me they'd been working for 6 months without pay, just the odd bag of oranges or slab of meat. No wonder the buzzwords democracy and liberalism became pejorative, and business, which had always meant shady dealings in Soviet times, was now equated with thievery and corruption and grasping oligarchs. And no wonder ordinary Russians' enthusiasm for the West began to evaporate. Add to that the trauma and confusion they suddenly felt when it came to their own identity. One minute, they were citizens of an international superpower, a country with as many nuclear weapons as the United States, as many Olympic medals, celebrated Nobel Prize winners, a world-class tradition of literature, ballet and music, and a space program which was actually in better shape than NASA's. And the next minute, that country had vanished overnight. And the new Russia which took its place was an economic basket case, saddled with debts it couldn't service, treated as a poor relation by the West, a land littered with bankrupt factories, and poorly protected by an army which couldn't even feed itself or maintain its equipment. I remember visiting Sevastopol in Crimea in 1994. It's right at the southernmost tip of the Crimean Peninsula, and it's the port where the Black Sea Fleet has its home. And every morning, the sailors would swab the decks and line up to salute the flag. But the big grey vessels never left harbour. They couldn't afford the fuel to go out on exercise. And Russians also had to contend with Boris Yeltsin, a president who, as time went on, could barely stand straight, let alone govern. When sober, he was unpredictable, going to war first with his own parliament and then rebellious Chechens. When drunk, he was a clown, turning Russia into a laughingstock. No surprise then that they welcomed Vladimir Putin, that bare-chested martial arts expert, who declared he could lift Russia off its knees and turn it into a country to be reckoned with. Besides all of this, for many Russians, the end of the Soviet Union was the loss of empire. For the other 14 republics, which made up the Soviet Federation, if you include the Baltics, including also Ukraine, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the start of life in an independent, sovereign country. For those in Western Ukraine, who only came under Moscow's rule as the result of World War II, it was especially welcome, a liberation from Soviet oppressors. But many Russians just felt that their large country had got smaller, and the exit of Ukraine seemed the biggest loss of all. This wasn't just another Soviet republic. It was for Russians a cultural, linguistic, and historical continuum. At school, they were taught that Kievan Rus was the birthplace of Russian Christianity. They saw Ukrainians as military allies, as part of a shared cultural heritage. And many people had parents and brothers and sisters and cousins who were now suddenly on the other side of an international border. The loss of Crimea was also felt acutely. Until 1954, it had been part of Russia, and it only ended up in Ukraine's jurisdiction because the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev handed it over in a moment of whimsy. So when Ukraine became an independent state and took Crimea with it, many Russians felt somehow cheated. In fact, if you go to the British Library and ask to see some of the old maps from their extraordinary collection of the time, you'll see that in fact the Crimea Peninsula was only part of Russia from the 18th century, when Catherine the Great took it from the Ottomans and established a Russian Khanate there, run by Turkic-speaking Crimean Tatars. They've remained there ever since, the original inhabitants, except for a grim interlude when Stalin shipped them off to labour camps. And now that Crimea has come back under Moscow's rule, though the Kremlin denies it, by all accounts, the Tatars are not having an easy time of it, a minority whose rights are being infringed and their future uncertain. Anyway, all this helps explain why Russians feel so strongly both about their place in the world and their relations with their Ukrainian neighbours. But President Putin has taken this sense of grievance and elaborated a much more complex conspiratorial tale. Listen to his recent speeches and it becomes clear that for him, the current crisis isn't really about Ukraine. It's a symptom of what he sees as a much deeper unresolved quarrel between Russia and the West. You may remember that he famously called the end of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. But for him, this wasn't just an accident of history. It was a deliberate provocation. In his view, the West, especially the United States, took advantage of Russia's relative weakness. In a major speech last autumn, entitled New Rules or No Rules, he pointed to what he said was the West's misplaced triumphalism when the Soviet Union collapsed. He was speaking to Russian experts at the so-called annual Valdai conference. I was in the audience. The end of the Cold War, he told us, should have been a collaborative venture agreed between the world's two paramount nuclear powers. But instead, the United States believed it was the sole victor and was therefore able to ignore and sideline the Soviet Union's successor state of Russia and remake the world along American lines. It was this American assumption of a unipolar world, Mr. Putin continued, which fueled Washington's ambition to extend the NATO military alliance right up to Russia's border with Estonia in the north and around the Black Sea basin in the south. And what's more, said Mr. Putin in his Valdai speech, this dangerous American belief in its own preeminence had deluded it into thinking it could intervene elsewhere in the globe without respect for national sovereignty or international law. Here, he cited the NATO bombing campaign against former Yugoslavia in 1999 and the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, both carried out without UN approval, and the NATO air campaign against Colonel Gaddafi in Libya in 2011, which he insisted ran counter to the authority given by the UN Security Council at the time, which was purely to protect civilians. In Mr. Putin's analysis, recent history has shown where this naive and reckless American instinct to fuel and fund revolutions inevitably has led to state collapse, bloodshed, ungoverned spaces that are havens for terrorists. Just look at the chaos in Libya, Syria, Iraq, he argued, and now in Ukraine. It's American meddling, not Russian actions, which is leading to further turmoil. So, does Mr. Putin have a point? Well, when it comes to the alarming spread of jihadist extremists from the so-called Islamic State across Iraq and Syria and the chaos in Libya, you have to say, well, yes, the US and its allies didn't adequately think through the risky consequences of their policies. And some Western analysts have for years been warning that expanding NATO eastwards was ill-advised without considering what reaction this might provoke from Russia, or at least without trying to come up with an alternative European security architecture to take account of its interests, a discussion which actually President Medvedev did try to start. The lack of UN Security Council approval ahead of the military action in Yugoslavia and Iraq has been criticised by not just Russia. In their defence, Western governments argue that in Kosovo they had no choice if they were to stop the Belgrade government's ethnic cleansing of Kosovo Albanians. The US-led invasion of Iraq is harder to justify. But in both cases, it sets a precedent of questionable legality, which inevitably has been used by Moscow to justify its own interventions. If a NATO bombardment was allowed to pave the way for Kosovo to secede unilaterally from Serbia, says the Kremlin, then why could Russia not send its troops to help South Ossetia and Abkhazia secede from Georgia and allow Crimea to break away from Ukraine? I've often wondered if relations with Putin's Russia today might have been different if George W. Bush had not become US president in the year 2000. Those hanging chads have a lot to answer for. His ambition, encouraged by his team of neocon advisors, to assert America's right to project its power and influence around the world, sidestepping international bodies like the UN and abandoning binding treaties, always looked risky. When Mr. Bush announced he was unilaterally walking out of a major Cold War arms treaty, the ABM Treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972, President Putin's reaction was actually relatively restrained, but it must have fueled his growing sense of grievance that the Americans believed there was one law for them and another law for everyone else. And when at the start of 2008, President Bush encouraged Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO, you've only got to glance at a map to realize that if you're a Russian president with a KGB background who's always been fixated on control and security and who's by now deeply suspicious of the West, this could easily be interpreted as a US-inspired plot to take over the Black Sea, right the way round, from Georgia through Turkey to Greece, Bulgaria, Romania and Ukraine, including Crimea, leaving Russia with just a tiny coastal foothold. But Mr. Putin isn't always right, and he isn't all right. Sometimes he rewrites the narrative to his advantage. For instance, he doesn't mention the fact that in the early 1990s, President Yeltsin's government had a very different view of the end of the Cold War. Maybe the young political reformers in his government who insisted on shock therapy went too fast for ordinary Russians, but their aim was to turn Russia into a Western-style democracy and functioning market economy as fast as possible. They had no nostalgia for the old Soviet Union. Its demise was a blessing, and they were staunch allies of Western governments. I met one of those former Yeltsin ministers recently. He's now a prominent Russian businessman, and he said he still believed in the radical reforms of the early 90s and this attempt to westernize Russia. And he's secretly horrified at what Mr. Putin is doing. He thinks he's turning the clock back. Though tellingly, our meeting was completely off the record. He thinks it's too dangerous nowadays to express his real opinions in public. And when it comes to NATO's new members, what Mr. Putin doesn't say is that they wanted to join the alliance rather than being pawns in some carve-up between big powers. Without exception, the former Warsaw Pact nations of Eastern and Central Europe, plus the 3 Baltic states, campaigned to come under NATO's umbrella precisely because they wanted a guarantee that never again would Russia take them over. And it's not even true that Mr. Putin himself always treated NATO with suspicion. He collaborated on a new Russia-NATO Joint Council set up to improve relations. In an interview with the BBC's David Frost in 1999, he even mused that one day maybe Russia itself might join NATO. And senior NATO officials have told me that in the early years of his presidency, while retired Russian generals might be grumbling from their armchairs at the alliance creeping ever closer to Russia's borders, Mr. Putin himself, in official meetings, never raised a complaint. Of course, we all change our views over time, and all politicians in particular modify their policies to suit the practicalities of the moment. And Mr. Putin would say, if some of his positions have shifted, then that's because he's learnt from bitter experience after repeatedly giving relations with the West a chance. He was the one to reach out to mend fences with NATO after the Yugoslav campaign. He was the one to phone George W. Bush and offer Russia's help after 9/11. He agreed to go along with Barack Obama's attempted reset relations, and every time, says Mr. Putin, he was let down. And now he's finally run out of patience with Western powers who never gave him or Russia due respect. I sometimes think that it's like a marriage that's gone off the rails. And Mr. Putin is the aggrieved wife, and the West is the wayward, thoughtless husband who's always had the upper hand. And now Vladimir Putin is fed up with his partner's philandering and hypocrisy. He doesn't want to go to counselling. He wants the marriage over, the house sold, the assets fairly divided so he gets due recompense for what he's put up with over the years, so he can turn his back on the United States and Europe and look for new friends in other parts of the world who he hopes will treat him better, like China. But Mr. Putin's mutating narrative is also important because it gives us an insight into his state of mind, and also because, let's face it, it's giving rise to some dangerous new myths about recent history. If you look at the recent pronouncement by Mr. Putin and those close to him, some of the claims made about Western intentions and actions are astonishing. Last autumn, a revealing newspaper interview with Nikolai Patrushev, who's the former head of the SSB intelligence service and he's now secretary of the powerful Security Council, laid out a scenario for how he believed the collapse of the Soviet Union was probably America's fault. He described how President Reagan allegedly sat down with his CIA chief in the 1980s to look for ways to weaken the Soviet Union. One way, he claimed, was to lure Soviet troops in Afghanistan into a protracted fight with the Mujahideen. Another was to cause oil prices to slump, hitting the Soviet economy hard. Another was for American leaders to inveigle a sadly naive Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, into misguided perestroika reforms which would cause collapse from within. And you hear similar things from President Putin himself, too. Last week, there was a new film to celebrate his 15 years in power, and in it he alleged that US intelligence had actively been involved in helping Chechen separatists against Russia in both the First and Second Chechen War. It's got to the point where wherever Russia has faced problems, Putin sees the hand of the American CIA. It's a worldview which sees conspiracy and threats from Russia's imagined enemies everywhere. Yet, let us remember reality. In fact, in 1991, George Bush Sr., far from encouraging Soviet collapse, desperately did not want the Soviet Union to fall. He was afraid that all the arms treaties which the United States had gone to such lengths to negotiate might be consigned to the dust heap. In fact, in 1991, just as things were hotting up, just before the collapse, he even went to Ukraine to urge nationalist leaders there to restrain their ambitions and stay inside the Soviet Union. It became known as President Bush's Chicken Kiev speech. And when the next US president, Bill Clinton, assumed office a few years later, he too showed no interest in undermining Russia. In fact, helping the Yeltsin government was one of his top priorities. At one time, he was reportedly spending 30% of his time thinking about how to help Russia. So perhaps we shouldn't take Mr. Putin's constant tales of Russian victimhood at face value. He may claim that the Russian bear is never the aggressor, but he does like on occasion to remind the world that it has teeth and claws, a veiled threat not lost on the smaller countries around Russia's borders. Their constant worry is that this Russian president, who so openly lamented the passing of the Soviet Union, may have set his heart on winning back control over former Soviet lands by arguing that Russia needs a cordon sanitaire of buffer states around its periphery to ensure its security. So, Russia's invasion of Georgia in the summer of 2008 and the 5-day war that ensued may not, in fact, have only been about saving Russian peacekeepers in South Ossetia from Georgian attack, as Mr. Putin claimed at the time, or even sending a message to NATO to steer clear of the Caucasus. As President Medvedev subsequently said, it was also a chance to take new territory under Russia's control. Aggression disguised as defense, in fact. The massive Russian troop buildup on the Georgian border had been there for weeks. It looked suspiciously as though Moscow was seeking a pretext for an invasion, not only to take over South Ossetia, a ramshackle haven of vodka and cigarette smuggling on the wrong side of the Caucasus Mountains and strategically useless to Russia. The real aim was to punish Georgia and its excitable and openly anti-Russian president, Mikhail Saakashvili, and the real prize was the tiny republic of Abkhazia on the Black Sea coast, like Crimea, prime seaside real estate and of real military value. Viewed in this way, you could see the Georgian War of 2008 as a dry run for what happened in Ukraine in 2014. First, a local government, seen as anti-Russian and in cahoots with the West, is accused of stirring up trouble and breaching human rights. Then Russia intervenes on so-called humanitarian grounds and to warn off NATO. Then Moscow establishes a new status quo where it has extended its sphere of influence and furthered its strategic territorial advantage, and sent a message to other republics on its periphery of what to expect if they too dared defy Moscow. Except this time, in 2014, Mr. Putin didn't get it all his own way. In 2008, European leaders wanted to avoid a full-blown conflict between Russia and the West over Georgia, so a delegation headed by President Sarkozy of France hurried to Moscow to secure a peace deal. And within days, both sides stepped back from the brink, leaving Russia still in control of the territory its troops had occupied. But that's not what happened entirely in Ukraine. It's true he met little resistance in Crimea, when Russia's so-called little green men, as the anonymous and alien troops in unmarked uniforms were called, appeared in Crimea. European ministers advised the new government in Kiev not to provoke Mr. Putin. But then when he annexed Crimea anyway, the Europeans were horrified. Whereas in 2008, they'd not been prepared to risk war with Russia over a murky little conflict in faraway Georgia, now they were faced with a flagrant violation of international law practically on Europe's doorstep. And this was the second time Mr. Putin had walked into another country, and he was openly warning he might go further. So Europe felt it had to retaliate. And so all 28 member states, some of them rather reluctantly, it has to be said, agreed to join the US in imposing sanctions on Russia. Ukraine, too, has given Mr. Putin more resistance than he probably bargained for. Instead of succumbing to Russia's terms for peace, the new Ukrainian president, the former chocolate magnate called Petro Poroshenko, launched a military campaign against the rebels in the east. And it may have left Kiev with a crippling conflict to shoulder, but it's also left Russia with an open sore on its western border. And now, though Mr. Putin may congratulate himself on Crimea's strategic and symbolic importance for Russia, he can't get away with the fact it's an expensive burden with no easy way to make it self-sufficient. It relies on Ukraine for much of its water and electricity, and Western sanctions have pretty well blocked any prospect of serious international investment in Crimea, as well as creating a negative climate which is seriously damaging the Russian economy as a whole. And meanwhile, the cost to Russia of the continuing war in eastern Ukraine is uncertain. Some unverified reports suggest thousands of Russian soldiers and volunteers may have been killed or wounded there. Certainly dozens have, and possibly hundreds, with similar or higher figures on the Ukrainian side. And there's no doubt the Russian government is acutely sensitive about these losses. Most Russian families only have one son. Many older people remember the zinc coffins arriving in villages, bringing their boys back from the disastrous Afghan war of the 1980s. No one wants another protracted conflict. So, why is Mr. Putin prepared to put up with this high cost? Well, one reason could be because he didn't expect it. and refuses to acknowledge it. Top economists in Moscow have told me they're almost frozen out of Kremlin decision-making. Mr. Putin and his closest associates don't want to talk about economic problems. They're focused only on security. But there's another possible interpretation for why Mr. Putin acted in Ukraine as he did, a more cynical or more paranoid motive, depending on whether you think he believes his own rhetoric. Maybe his intervention was neither really about protecting the rights of Russian speakers or even about extending Russia's own security cordon. It may have had much more to do with Mr. Putin's fear of what would happen to his own power if the contagion of an uprising, a coloured revolution, spread to Russia. A popular uprising, toppling the president, destroying his power base, so all he can do is flee for his life, ending up either in exile, prison, or lynched by mobbing rioters. There's no doubt this has been on Mr. Putin's mind. Ever since the so-called Rose Revolution in Georgia, which removed Edward Shevardnadze in 2003, and the Orange Revolution in Ukraine a year later, Mr. Putin's expressed a deep suspicion of these coloured uprisings, which in the name of democracy and claiming to express the will of the people have challenged election results and brought down governments. It's probably one reason why Russia stayed so silent as the presidents of Egypt and Tunisia were toppled in 2011 in the so-called Arab Spring uprisings. And I'd guess it's one reason why he's so staunchly defending President Assad in Syria. And it may be why he's more than once publicly expressed his horror and disgust at the final fates of Saddam Hussein and Colonel Gaddafi. And of course, he has some reason to be nervous. In late 2011, to the astonishment of many observers and opposition leaders, tens of thousands of Russians took to the streets in Moscow and other cities, incensed at what they saw as widespread fraud in parliamentary elections, apparently because the Kremlin's favoured party was headed for defeat. At the time, Mr. Putin stayed largely silent, but he must have been profoundly shaken. This wasn't supposed to happen. His authority and legitimacy rested on him being demonstrably the Russian people's preferred choice as leader. And here were thousands of people on the streets of the capital calling for his removal. The following March, he ran for presidency to return for a third term. On an election day, as voting ended and exit polls began to predict he'd win by a landslide, he came out of the Kremlin to be congratulated by a specially gathered crowd. And what was extraordinary was his emotion. His voice was hoarse, tears rolled down his cheeks. His spokesman later insisted it was just a cold wind making his eyes water, but you could see how relieved he was to have managed to take back the presidency without mishap. The point is, those 2011 Russian protests must have made him realise that he's vulnerable. And his worry about Ukraine might be that if a popular uprising there manages to turn the country into another Poland, prosperous, modern, democratic Western, well, might it infect Russia? Then instead of being constantly grateful to Mr. Putin for saving them from the nightmare of the 90s, the Russian people might take to the streets again, and this time the calls for regime change could be more insistent. A good reason, if that's what he thinks, for Mr. Putin to want to keep Ukraine weak, unstable, and unsuccessful. Does he really believe this danger of contagion? That the American CIA fueled the Orange Revolution, the protests in Moscow, and what's been happening in Ukraine? Well, let's not forget this is a man trained by the KGB in techniques of manipulation and provocation. He understands how to steer public opinion and shape events. It's made him expert at rolling out a formidable information war as part of the current conflict. But such skills can be corrosive. They breed cynicism and distrust. So either he truly does believe there's an American conspiracy, or maybe he just chooses to pretend that he does, because either way it's an excuse to rally Russians to protect the national interest and keep him in office. So where does this leave Russia? What's the mood at the moment? How might it affect how Mr. Putin decides how he'll handle the crisis? You can't deny that Mr. Putin is looking popular. Recent polls suggest his approval ratings are over 80%, and negative attitudes towards Europe and the United States have doubled. There are public manifestations of patriotism everywhere, and it's matched by what people tell you. They feel a new pride in Russia, and finally, after all they've been through in the last 2 decades, they want to believe that it's true, that it's back as a big player on the world stage. And the return of Crimea to Russia has helped fuel that patriotism, which neatly slotted into the pageantry of the Sochi Olympics. First we won the Olympics, Now we've got Crimea back, and now we're also ice hockey champions, one girl said to me. Sport, spectacle, and geopolitics, all gain and no cost, rolled into one continuous virtual reality TV show. And if anything, the imposition of Western sanctions has just intensified the patriotism and antagonism towards the West. I tried it out on shoppers at a Moscow supermarket a couple of weeks ago and found everyone was complaining about rising prices and fear of job losses. But they all said, well, we'll put up with it, and of course we'll tighten our belt for the sake of the nation. After all, it's the West that's doing it to us, said one woman. You're the enemy, aren't you? Some people even actively welcome sanctions as a way for Russia to cut its ties with the West and make itself more self-reliant by substituting imports with homegrown produce and productions. Only those already critical of the government or sophisticated in their understanding of the economy point out that many of Russia's economic problems are of its own making, like its over-reliance on oil and gas exports, or the counter-sanctions against fresh food from Europe, which is what's behind a lot of the price rises on food. And there's no doubt that this patriotic mood has empowered groups which were once marginal, like the leathered and tattooed bikers club Night Wolves, whose leader was an early campaigner for Crimea to join Russia. Now President Putin dons his leathers and rides with them. And echoing the president's sentiments, they've helped instigate a campaign against what they call the fifth column. In other words, any Russian who speaks out against the president or the Kremlin. And what's striking is that these days it's not just ultra-nationalist bikers who hold these views. So do many members of the Duma, the Russian parliament, people in the media, academia, even business. In all seriousness, they tell you that anyone who opposes the government probably works for the CIA, is a threat to national security, and should be put in jail. It's also a frequent message on Russian television, the need to hunt down and deal with enemies. More than one Russian has told me it's impossible to watch television anymore. The propaganda reminds them not so much of the end of the Brezhnev era, but something more sinister, the haranguing tone, the repression and paranoia of the late 1940s, the worst years of Stalinism. And what's interesting is that these messages seem to be so effective and difficult to counter. These aren't the hollow falsehoods of the late Soviet period when the glorious achievements of the Communist Party clearly didn't correspond to reality. It's all much more sophisticated. It allows for the appearance of many points of view, though the opposition guests usually get shouted down. And the patriotic appeal has so much more resonance than the empty ideology of Brezhnev's era. But I must admit that my suspicions about Mr. Putin's popularity are there. It may be wide at the moment, but how deep is it? And how fickle could it prove if somehow he lost his aura of invincibility? I don't trust the opinion polls. Society is polarized. Those who support Mr. Putin speak out, but those who don't keep quiet, out of fear of the authorities, but also opprobrium of other Russians. On a visit to a provincial town recently, one woman said to me, you know, people don't talk on the buses anymore. They're silent. They used to chat and complain about the government, but they're scared again. We went to a local college to talk to students and ask their views of politics. Last time I did this 3 years ago in another city. Admittedly, we had a lively debate about whether Mr. Putin was a good thing or not. But this time there was no discussion. They all loyally supported the president. And afterwards, when my producer asked one girl, would she ever like to move abroad? And she said, oh, yes, I'd love to. Another girl came up to her and said, you shouldn't say that. You've got to be patriotic. So does Mr. Putin have cause to worry? If sanctions aren't lifted, if the oil price drops, if the economic condition worsens? You might be forgiven for saying crisis. What crisis if you were in Moscow? There may be a few shops up for rent, but otherwise it's still as glitzy and glamorous as it ever was. But when you talk to people, especially in private, you realize they're quite worried. One young entrepreneur I've been tracking lost 70% of his business last year. A friend of his who was selling fish aquariums has seen his business collapse almost completely. These are people who can cancel their foreign holiday and stop buying imported wine. They'll adapt and survive. And as a last resort, they'll leave and go and set up businesses in Latvia or Bulgaria. But go out to the provinces where there's no trickle down from Moscow, and you find people already living on the edge. Towns full of defunct factories, many of them bankrupt since Soviet times. In recent years, I was told locals tended to commute to where the jobs were in Moscow, but now those jobs are ending, they're coming home, and what are they going to do? So, it may be that the ruble will rally further and oil prices will go up. And as after the 2008 financial crisis, Russia will weather this dip and maybe even emerge the stronger from it. And anyway, no catastrophe is imminent. Russia has billions in sovereign wealth funds to bail out the country for at least 18 months, if not longer. And even if the economic conditions worsen, my hunch is that Russians probably won't rise up in anger. Like those factory workers I remember from the 1990s, they'll carry on working for months with no pay. They'll put up with it and hope things get better. Hanging on to the jobs they have, going out and digging the vegetable plot at the dacha for potatoes and keeping their heads down. But longer term, I think what could change, maybe gradually, is the nationwide belief in Putin as a strong president and Russia as a strong country. However clever the propaganda on television, it'll start to grate if too many people lose their jobs, can't get hold of vital medicines, or struggle to afford basic food. I'm beginning to hear about people with heart attacks in their 40s, said one woman, like in the 1990s. And I think that might be the problem for Mr. Putin, a fear among ordinary people that there is a spectre of collapse and the country might be in danger of returning to the nightmare of the 1990s, which he was supposed to have got rid of forever. As one Kremlin consultant put it to me recently, it's not true that Russia's a dictatorship. Putin's popularity matters. He needs to show he has public support to validate his mandate and to prove to those around him that he really is irreplaceable. He's an emperor, and part of the trick is he has to get the crowd to believe he does have clothes, that he's the best answer to Russia's problem. If the illusion is broken, then he's finished. So is he worried? Well, not publicly. In fact, those who get close to him say he seems curiously serene, as though convinced against all the odds that he's doing the right thing. But there are one or two signs that his regime is perhaps not as resilient as it likes to claim it is. Number one is the shocking murder of the opposition leader Boris Nemtsov in late February, as he walked home across a bridge right next to the Kremlin. Each side, government and opposition, have blamed the other. Several Chechens have been arrested. It's still not clear who ordered the assassination, carried out in the full glare of streetlights and security cameras a stone's throw from the Kremlin, or what message they were sending. The Kremlin political consultant I spoke to revealed he'd been rung by worried members of the presidential administration within 20 minutes of them being informed of the murder, to run through options of who could have possibly been behind it. If this isn't spin, and the consultant is to be believed, it doesn't sound like an administration which is in full control of the situation. And why, once the Chechen gunmen were arrested, did Chechnya's wayward president, Ramzan Kadyrov, ostensibly a big Putin fan, go out of his way to praise one of them as a loyal Muslim and Chechen? He was totally out of step with the Kremlin line that these were gunmen and culprits of a crime aimed at destabilizing the government. And what could have been the reason when, almost immediately afterwards, President Putin then gave Ramzan Kadyrov a medal for loyalty? Was it to vainly try to shut him up and persuade him to be more obedient? Some think there's a behind-the-scenes turf war raging between the Chechen president and Russia's federal security services, who want to impose their writ over Chechnya, which is, after all, supposed to be part of Russia. Maybe that's why President Putin mysteriously disappeared in March, to distance himself from the feuding sides and remind them by his absence that they can't do without him. Last week there was another tantalizing glimpse. After a Chechen was shot in a gun battle with Russian police, President Kadyrov angrily issued an order to shoot Russian security personnel on sight if they tried to enter Chechnya without permission. An extraordinary act of defiance. That order has now disappeared from his website. But the fact he's not been hauled over the coals for making what was essentially death threats against Russian federal security officials suggests Mr. Putin is, well, perhaps afraid of igniting another Chechen rebellion and once again undermining his reputation as leader. After all, he came to power as president on the back of a campaign to subdue this part of the Northern Caucasus. Any hint that Chechnya is once again out of control is yet another thing to erode his image as strong and capable leader. Let me end where I began, with the crisis between Russia and the West over Ukraine, and where it might be heading. There have been fears that if Mr. Putin is under all this pressure at home, he might lash out again and embark on a new foray abroad to create a new crisis to shore up his domestic popularity. I may be wrong, but I think it's unlikely. There's no appetite among ordinary Russians to get drawn into foreign adventures. Winning back Crimea without bloodshed was one thing. The quagmire in eastern Ukraine is another. Typically, people furrow their brow and say all war is bad and what's happening in Ukraine should stop. "We shouldn't send troops anywhere," said one old lady, a Putin admirer. "We should look after our own here in Russia." Tellingly, Mr. Putin has, for the moment at least, stopped talking about his right to come to the aid of Russian speakers in other countries, and he no longer uses the term Novorossiya, or New Russian Lands, for eastern Ukraine, and he doesn't refer to the rebels' calls for self-determinations or the idea of Ukraine being broken up into a looser federation or confederative state. In fact, on the contrary, in the recent Minsk peace deal he was part of, he pushed for Ukraine to end its blockade of eastern Ukraine and reincorporate it inside a Ukrainian unitary state with some level of autonomy, a far cry from what the rebel leaders themselves say they want. But this doesn't necessarily mean the crisis in eastern Ukraine is any closer to being solved. Commanders on both sides on the ground seem to expect that before long the crumbling ceasefire will completely collapse. The Ukrainian side reports a build-up of heavy weaponry, apparently coming from Russia, which they fear could could presage an attack on the port of Mariupol, the first step, if it were to happen, towards Russia trying to create a land bridge to Crimea. And for their part, the Russian government has said, unsurprisingly, given its view of the American role in this conflict, reacted extremely negatively to news that the US has begun to offer military training to the Ukrainian army. It could be the ceasefire will stay in place until June or July, when EU leaders have to decide whether to prolong the most serious sanctions. Mr. Putin may hope he can persuade Greece and Cyprus and a few other countries sympathetic to him to block the renewal of sanctions and take some of the pressure off. But if sanctions aren't lifted, and I think they won't be, then the conflict will flare up again for another round of intense fighting over the summer, probably. And longer term, my hunch is Ukraine will slowly find its feet with extraordinary amounts of aid from the IMF and the West, and the big losers in this conflict will be the Russian people, in danger of once again being cordoned off from Europe as travel to the West becomes more difficult and expensive or is increasingly frowned upon, and as the rift between Russia and the West grows deeper, as more ties are cut, the Russian government will turn further inwards, passing more laws and security measures to shore up its defences against hostile foreigners, real or imagined. Thank you.